German prisoners of war arrived in the United States during World War II with a sense of cultural pride, even superiority. Many of them were captured in North Africa or Europe and shipped across the Atlantic to camps spread throughout the American Midwest and South. When they first saw the way American guards and soldiers lived in camps, especially the reliance on tents instead of solid wooden or stone barracks, the German POWs laughed. To their eyes, tents were primitive, temporary, and even childish compared to the rigid, solid military housing they were used to in Europe. To understand why this moment became such a point of irony later, we need to look at the mindset of these German soldiers. They came from a military tradition that emphasized permanence, discipline, and structure. The Wehrmacht prided itself on organization, order, and engineering strength. For many Germans, especially those raised under the Nazi regime, material symbols of stability, brick, wood, steel, were deeply associated with authority and power. So, when they saw American soldiers content to live under canvas roofs, they thought it was laughable, almost pathetic. The Americans, however, had a different philosophy. Their army valued mobility, flexibility, and adaptability. Tents were not a sign of weakness, but a practical solution to conditions that could change at any time. A tent could be pitched quickly, taken down, and moved to another location with minimal effort. It represented the American way of war: speed, efficiency, and improvisation. But the German POWs did not see that immediately. All they saw were flimsy pieces of fabric pretending to be homes. The laughter continued in the first weeks. POWs mocked the guards, joked among themselves, and even wrote in their diaries about the ridiculousness of American camp life. In their minds, if the Americans could not even build proper housing, how could they possibly be as powerful as their reputation suggested? They looked down on the U.S. Army, failing to recognize the deeper practicality behind those canvas walls. But then came the storms. The first real test arrived in the form of violent summer thunderstorms that swept across states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, where many of these camps were built. The weather in the American heartland is notorious for its unpredictability. One day could be hot, clear, and calm, and the next could unleash pounding rain, strong winds, and even tornadoes. German POWs who had never experienced this kind of climate before were about to learn a hard lesson. When the storms hit, the barracks that had been built for the German POWs, constructed from cheaper wood, hastily nailed together, suffered serious damage. Roofs leaked, walls bent, windows shattered. The supposedly solid housing crumbled under nature's assault. Meanwhile, the American tents, engineered with flexibility in mind, bent but did not break. The wind passed around them, the rain slid off their slanted tops, and they stood firm. The Germans were stunned. The very structures they had ridiculed turned out to be stronger, smarter, and far more reliable in the face of extreme weather. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. Respect replaced ridicule. Many German POWs admitted later that they had underestimated the ingenuity of the Americans. This story may seem small, but it reveals something profound about cultural perception, military engineering, and the clash of values during wartime. It was not just about tents versus barracks. It was about flexibility versus rigidity, adaptability versus pride, and humility versus arrogance. And it's a story that continued to echo throughout the years these POWs spent in America. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States held around 425,000 Axis prisoners of war, the vast majority being Germans. They were scattered across roughly 700 camps, often in rural areas where land was cheap and manpower was needed. These POWs worked on farms, in factories, and in local communities, all under supervision. While they were technically captives, many lived relatively comfortable lives compared to the horrors of Europe at that time. In Texas, for example, there were dozens of such camps. The climate was hot, the storms fierce, and the terrain flat and exposed. Americans knew from experience that permanent wooden barracks, especially if built cheaply and quickly, would not survive long in such conditions. So, for their own soldiers, they relied heavily on tent systems refined through years of military practice. These tents were not the flimsy camping gear of civilians. They were large, reinforced, and designed to withstand wind and rain. The German POWs arrived, expecting structures that mirrored the stone fortresses of Europe. Instead, they saw rows of canvas. They equated it with weakness. But what they failed to grasp was that American engineering often leaned toward practical innovation rather than imposing appearances. For weeks, life in the camps carried on with this cultural tension simmering in the background. Germans sneered, Americans shrugged it off, and the sun blazed overhead. Then, as summer deepened, the thunderstorms rolled in. The sky darkened with thick, heavy clouds. Winds howled across the plains. Sheets of rain slammed into the ground, turning dirt paths into muddy rivers. Inside the German barracks, conditions grew miserable quickly. Water poured in through cracks. The wooden walls shook. Some roofs partially collapsed. Germans scrambled to keep their belongings dry and cursed the cheap American construction. Meanwhile, the American tents held their ground. Their flexible poles and tightly stretched canvas allowed the structures to sway with the wind rather than resist it rigidly. Rain rolled harmlessly down their sides. The soldiers inside stayed relatively dry, safe, and calm. When morning came and the storm finally passed, the difference was undeniable. The barracks looked battered and broken, while the tents still stood. This was the turning point. The German POWs, who had mocked these tents so relentlessly, were forced to acknowledge the strength of American design. Their rigid worldview cracked just like the wooden planks of their barracks, and in that moment they learned a lesson about humility. The symbolism here is powerful. The Germans had built their war machine on the idea of dominance, permanence, and immovable strength, but that very rigidity made them vulnerable, not just in engineering, but in strategy. The Americans, by contrast, embraced adaptability. Their weapons, their tactics, and even their housing reflected a mindset that change was inevitable and must be planned for. The storm story, in miniature, captured that entire contrast. Over time, many German POWs began to respect their captors in ways they had never expected. They noticed how well the Americans fed them, how fair the guards often were, and how resourceful even ordinary soldiers could be. The tents were just the beginning of that realization, but the memory of that first storm stuck with them. Some later recounted the event in memoirs, remembering how they had laughed at the tents and then been silenced by nature itself. What had once seemed like a joke became a point of admiration. This story also reveals something broader about wartime propaganda and perception. Germans had been told repeatedly that America was decadent, weak, and unprepared for real war. They arrived expecting to see evidence of that weakness. When they thought they found it in the form of tents, they clung to their bias. But reality shattered that illusion. The so-called weak solution was, in fact, the smarter one. It's fascinating to think about how many similar moments must have occurred across different POW camps. Small clashes of culture, small shocks of realization, small moments of respect. For men who had been taught to hate and dehumanize their enemies, these encounters with American practicality could be transformative. The tents versus barracks story is not just an anecdote, it's a metaphor. It shows how arrogance can blind people to innovation. It shows how flexibility can triumph over rigidity. And it shows how even prisoners of war, hardened by ideology and violence, can learn to respect their captors when reality proves them wrong. And this was only the beginning. Because the German POW's time in America was filled with unexpected lessons, surprising friendships, and ironic moments of cultural exchange. The storm that proved American tents stronger than German barracks was not just an isolated event. It became a symbol of the entire prisoner of war experience in the United States. After that moment, German POWs began to see America through different eyes, and their lives in captivity developed in ways they could not have imagined when they first set foot on American soil. To understand the depth of this transformation, we have to follow their journey beyond the laughter and the storm, into the daily rhythm of POW camp life, the unexpected relationships that formed, and the lessons that reshaped their worldview. When German soldiers were captured in North Africa after battles like El Alamein or Tunisia, they were often disoriented, exhausted, and stripped of the myth of invincibility that Nazi propaganda had drilled into them. Transported across the ocean, many expected harsh treatment, even brutality. Instead, they were surprised by the relative comfort of American camps. They had clean clothes, decent food, and medical care that many civilians in war-torn Europe would have envied. It was not paradise, but it was humane, and for men who had been taught to expect cruelty from their enemies, it was shocking. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required signatories to treat prisoners of war with dignity, and the United States largely respected those rules. German POWs were given rations comparable to those of American soldiers, and they were allowed to receive mail from their families. They could even organize concerts, play soccer, and engage in educational programs. Camps often had libraries stocked with books in German, and classes were offered so that POWs could study subjects ranging from mathematics to agriculture. For many young Germans, this was the first chance they had ever had to freely explore knowledge outside of Nazi indoctrination. One recurring theme in memoirs of German POWs is the way small details of daily life impressed them. They noticed that American guards treated them not as subhuman enemies, but as men. They saw the abundance of food in the United States compared to the rationing and hunger that plagued Europe. They noticed how ordinary Americans lived, farmers, workers, and shopkeepers, and realized that the propaganda they had been fed about American decadence and weakness was a lie. At the same time, POW labor became an essential part of the American war effort on the home front. With so many American men serving overseas, there was a shortage of farmhands and factory workers. German POWs were put to work in fields harvesting crops, in sawmills cutting lumber, and even in canning plants processing food. While some resisted at first, most quickly realized that working meant more privileges, better treatment, and something valuable to do with their time. Many farmers later remembered with surprise how hard-working and skilled the German prisoners were, and some even maintained correspondence after the war ended. These interactions began to humanize both sides. American civilians who met German POWs discovered that they were not monsters, but young men, many barely out of their teens, caught up in a war they had not chosen. German prisoners, in turn, discovered that Americans were not the weak, corrupt caricatures Nazi propaganda had described. The tent versus barracks story had opened the first crack in their arrogance, and daily life widened that crack into a new perspective. One of the most remarkable aspects of German POW life in America was the shift in identity that occurred over time. When they first arrived, many were fiercely loyal to the Nazi cause. Some camps even had secret cells of die-hard Nazi officers who tried to intimidate fellow prisoners into obedience. There were incidents where POWs suspected of disloyalty to Hitler were beaten or even murdered by their peers. But as the war dragged on and news of German defeats trickled in, loyalty began to fade. The POWs who interacted more with Americans were often the first to break away from Nazi ideology. They saw a society that, while imperfect, allowed freedoms they had never known in Germany. They saw black and white soldiers serving together, women working in factories, and ordinary people living without the constant fear of secret police. This did not instantly turn them into Democrats, but it planted seeds of doubt about the system they had served. Returning to the theme of tents and storms, it becomes clear that the episode was a metaphor for a larger truth. The Germans had built their identity on rigid strength, but that rigidity crumbled under pressure, while the Americans had built theirs on adaptability, which proved stronger in the long run. The same applied to political systems. Nazi Germany demanded absolute obedience and punished deviation, but it could not withstand the unpredictable storm of a global war. America, with its improvisational spirit and decentralized strength, bent with the winds of history and survived. German POWs lived inside that lesson every day. Some of the most fascinating stories involve POWs who later chose to return to America after the war. Having experienced the country firsthand, they compared it to the devastation of post-war Germany and decided that the American way of life was worth pursuing. By some estimates, more than 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the United States after the war ended. Many others carried positive impressions back to Germany, helping to shape West Germany's alignment with the United States during the Cold War. The tents, the storms, and the laughs that turned into respect were small moments, but they echoed across decades. Of course, not every POW had a positive experience. Some resented their captivity, longed for home, and refused to engage with their captors in any meaningful way. Others clung to Nazi ideology until the very end. But the general trend was one of gradual softening, of shifting from hostility to reluctant admiration. The irony of the tense was a crack in the wall of arrogance, and once a crack forms, it often widens with time. Daily camp life included strict routines. Prisoners woke early, ate meals together, and were counted multiple times a day. They attended roll calls, worked assigned shifts, and returned to their barracks at night. Guards maintained discipline, but compared to the brutality of other theaters of war, these routines felt manageable, even comfortable. Some camps allowed POWs to form orchestras and choirs, staging concerts for themselves and sometimes even for the local American population. Others organized sports tournaments, with soccer being the most popular. These activities gave prisoners a sense of normalcy and reminded them of life before the war. In those moments, under the vast American sky, they realized that the enemy was not always the monster they had imagined. Another striking difference was food. German POWs often commented on the abundance and variety of American meals. While the U.S. military itself faced shortages and rationing, the prisoners still received meals that far exceeded what they had eaten back home. Bread, meat, vegetables, and even occasional treats like fruit or chocolate shocked them. Some later admitted that their time as prisoners was the first time they had ever been consistently well fed. This abundance contrasted sharply with the scarcity in Europe and left a lasting impression. Farmers who employed POWs for labor sometimes invited them into their homes for meals, further breaking down barriers. These interactions, though technically discouraged by regulations, happened frequently and created personal bonds that survived the war. In memoirs written decades later, former POWs recalled the kindness of American families with gratitude. The longer the war continued, the more POWs realized that their time in America was shaping them in unexpected ways. They had arrived mocking tents and laughing at what they thought was weakness, but they left with respect for the very things they had dismissed. They began to see adaptability not as weakness, but as strength, humility not as humiliation, but as wisdom. And when they finally returned to a shattered Germany, those lessons became part of their rebuilding process. The POW camps became, unintentionally, classrooms of democracy and resilience. The symbolism of tents and storms lived on in their memories because it was the first time they had seen with their own eyes that appearances could deceive, that practicality could triumph over pride, and that their enemies had strengths that propaganda had never admitted. In a way, those storms washed away illusions. The laughter that had once filled the camps turned into silence, then into thought, and finally into understanding. That understanding was one of the quiet victories of the war, invisible on battle maps but powerful in the hearts and minds of men. When we look back today, the story of German POWs laughing at American tents until storms proved them stronger might seem small compared to the grand scale of World War II. Yet it captures a timeless truth about human nature and conflict. We judge too quickly. We assume strength where there is weakness and weakness where there is strength. But storms, literal or metaphorical, reveal the truth. They expose the flaws in rigidity and highlight the value of adaptability. For the German prisoners, it was a humbling revelation. For us, it remains a reminder not to underestimate resilience, even when it looks simple or unimpressive. And this is why history matters. Because within these small stories, hidden in the corners of vast wars, are lessons that continue to resonate today. The tents stood firm because they were designed to bend. The barracks fell because they resisted too rigidly. And in that contrast lies a lesson about survival, humility, and wisdom. If you've stayed with this story until now, you know that the past has so much to teach us about the present. The tale of tents and storms is more than an anecdote. It is a mirror reflecting back our assumptions and asking us to reconsider them. If you found this story meaningful, if you want to hear more forgotten tales that reveal the human side of history, then make sure to subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button, share this video with friends who love history, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive. Because history is not just about battles and dates, It's about people, choices, ironies, and lessons that still shape our world today. Subscribe now, and let's keep uncovering those stories together.